The city lived at the fracture point between night and rain. It never slept, it only shifted weight from one shadow to another, letting neon and streetlights pretend that darkness had rules. Stone absorbed footsteps without complaint, concrete swallowed echoes, glass returned faces that did not quite belong to the people passing by. The air always carried the same aftertaste: overheated metal, wet dust, ozone from cables hidden behind walls. It was a city that had learned long ago that questions created liabilities, and liabilities were expensive. Myra moved through it as if she had been shaped for this rhythm. She worked where names were optional and memory was selective. Night archives sealed behind biometric locks, intermediary contracts that never appeared in court, documents that had technically ceased to exist the moment they were signed. Her job was not to ask why something had been erased, only to understand how cleanly it had been done and whether it could be undone if someone paid enough. She read margins, gaps, inconsistencies. She knew which stains meant water damage and which meant panic. In this city, survival depended on knowing when to stop looking. Her schedule was deliberately irregular. She avoided patterns the way other people avoided illness. Nights bled into mornings without ceremony, and she slept in fragments, never deeply, never long enough to dream. The city rewarded that discipline by leaving her mostly alone. Mostly was the best outcome anyone could expect. Her past had been removed with precision. There had been no dramatic rupture, no visible violence. Just doors that stopped opening, calls that were never returned, records quietly amended. The absence was surgical, but the consequences lingered in ways she could not fully map. She knew she belonged to a world of clans, though the knowledge felt second-hand, inherited rather than lived. It surfaced in the way certain people looked through her instead of at her, or in how some spaces felt subtly resistant to her presence, as if the walls themselves remembered something she did not. Sometimes, late at night, reflections betrayed her. In shop windows or mirrored facades, she caught movement that did not align with her own. A shift too fluid, too alert, not human in its economy of motion. Those moments never lasted long enough to become proof. The city exhaled, traffic surged, and the illusion dissolved. She learned not to turn too quickly. The city respected that kind of restraint. The night everything tilted felt ordinary at first. Rain pressed down in thin, relentless sheets, turning streets into reflective surfaces that fractured light into long, nervous streaks. Myra left the archive building just before dawn, coat pulled tight, breath measured. That was when she noticed the discrepancy. Not a presence, not a sound, but a distortion in rhythm. Someone adjusted pace when she did. Not hastily, not clumsily. Whoever it was understood the tempo of the city well enough to blend into it. She changed routes once, casually, slipping down a side street cluttered with delivery bays and unmarked doors. The sensation persisted. Not pursuit, exactly. Observation. The kind that did not require proximity to function. She felt no panic, only calculation. Panic belonged to people who believed in fairness. She headed toward the old warehouse district, a stretch of land the city pretended not to see. The buildings there had been abandoned in phases, each decade leaving behind another layer of neglect. Cameras existed, but they were either broken, deliberately angled away, or owned by parties with no interest in sharing footage. The air grew colder, heavier. The rain sounded different against rusted metal. As she crossed the invisible boundary, the city changed texture. The noise softened, compressed. Her footsteps seemed louder, more intrusive. The sensation that followed was not fear, but recognition of imbalance. The darkness gathered rather than receded, as if it had been waiting for permission. She stopped near a loading dock and allowed her posture to relax, signaling awareness without challenge. That was when the space itself reacted. The quiet became too complete, the kind that erased background noise rather than merely lowering it. She understood then that whatever had followed her was no longer concerned with remaining unseen. The attack never came. Instead, something intervened with the inevitability of a closed system correcting itself. Movement, controlled and precise, disrupted the tension without escalation. The threat withdrew as if recalled, leaving behind nothing but displaced air and the faint sense of having been measured and found insufficient. Myra registered the presence behind her before she turned. It was not stealth that announced him, but authority. The kind that altered environments without effort. He stood where the light failed most completely, not merged with shadow but distinct from it. His stillness carried weight. The city seemed to rearrange itself around him, edges sharpening, distances recalibrating. He did not approach. He did not speak. He did not need to. His attention was focused, analytical, uncomfortably thorough. Myra felt it as a pressure rather than a gaze. Something in her responded, a muted tension she could not identify, as if a locked mechanism had been tested for weaknesses. For a brief, disorienting second, she became aware of scent. Not perfume, not rain. Something deeper, biological, carrying memory rather than information. It unsettled her more than any visible threat could have. Her body reacted before her mind could interpret the signal. The moment passed. Control reasserted itself, but not without residue. He turned away first, already disengaging. The encounter had concluded on his terms, cleanly, without loose ends. By the time she moved again, he was gone, leaving no trace beyond the lingering certainty that this had not been random. Myra remained where she was until the city's noise began to seep back in, tentative at first, then confident. Engines started. Distant voices bled through the rain. The warehouse district resumed its careful neglect. She walked home along a different route, senses sharpened, mind cataloging details she did not yet understand. The city felt closer, more attentive, as if something had shifted its focus and would not look away again. That night, as she locked her door and shed the damp layers of the city, Myra understood one thing with clarity that bordered on dread. The city that never asked questions had finally noticed her, and attention, once given, was rarely withdrawn without a price. Marcus had not risen out of shadow the way the city liked to mythologize its predators. He had risen out of order. Out of signatures that looked harmless to an untrained eye, out of meeting agendas where the most important decisions were never written down, out of charity galas where money moved like perfume and everyone pretended it was clean. He lived in the narrow space between legality and legitimacy, where both could be purchased and neither could be trusted. On paper, he chaired a foundation that funded hospitals, scholarships, and urban renewal projects. His name appeared beside photographs of ribbon cuttings and solemn handshakes. In reality, the foundation's boardroom was a checkpoint in a larger system, one that fed on debt, obligation, and the slow, obedient fear of people who knew what happened to those who broke agreements. It was not an empire that needed banners. It was a web that had learned how to look like infrastructure. He was respected not because he was the most violent man in the city, but because he made violence unnecessary more often than not. Predictability was his true weapon. People could anticipate his responses, calculate outcomes, and convince themselves that as long as they followed the rules, they would not be destroyed. That illusion kept the city stable. It also kept him in control. He never performed power. He did not raise his voice. He did not fill rooms with charm. He did not enjoy being watched. In crowded spaces, he seemed almost minimal, tailored restraint, clean lines, a quiet that did not seek attention yet drew it anyway. His face rarely betrayed mood. His eyes did not linger on people for pleasure. They assessed. They measured. They filed everything into categories that only mattered to him. His routines were built like fortifications. He woke before the city softened into morning, spent an hour moving through a private gym that smelled of disinfectant and iron, then reviewed briefings delivered in neutral language. Numbers, names, locations, timelines. He treated information the way surgeons treated blood, as something necessary, controlled, and never sentimental. He did not allow himself to be surprised if he could help it, and he could help it more often than most. Even his residences were engineered for control. High above the city, behind layers of security that looked like modern convenience, his penthouse carried the atmosphere of a place designed to contain. The glass walls revealed a skyline that glittered like an animal's eye, but the interior was spare and intentional. No clutter, no unnecessary softness. The air always held the faint, controlled scent of cedar and cold stone, like a reminder that comfort was a choice, not a right. There were men around him who believed they worked for him. There were also people who believed they owned him through tradition, blood, old pacts that predated the city's current shape. Marcus treated both groups with the same calm. He respected structure, not claims. If something had survived long enough to become a rule, he studied it. If it had weaknesses, he reinforced them or dismantled them. He did not fear old power, but he did not dismiss it either. Old power had teeth even when it smiled. There was, beneath everything, another layer he kept sealed. It was not a secret he could confess and be absolved of. It was a condition of being. A pressure that lived behind his ribs, a constant, quiet insistence that he was never entirely alone inside himself. He did not call it a curse. He did not romanticize it as ancestry. He treated it as a volatile asset that required strict management. It was the beast, though he never let himself use that word with anything like reverence. It was a second set of instincts, older than his learned discipline, more brutal in its logic. It tracked threats by scent and subtle shifts in air. It recognized dominance, weakness, and lies in the micro-movements of a body. It would have been easy, years ago, to surrender to it. Many did. In this world, surrender was often mistaken for authenticity. Marcus had chosen control instead. He had built his identity around it, welded it into every decision, every negotiation, every glance that refused to soften. He told himself that control was morality, that it was the only thing separating him from the same chaos he managed. He told himself that being cold was better than being reckless. He told himself 1,000 things that kept the beast quiet. On the night he crossed paths with Myra, the city had been doing what it always did when rain fell, hiding its ugliness beneath reflections. Marcus had been leaving a private dinner with donors whose money came from industries that pretended to be benign. He had nodded, shook hands, allowed a camera to capture his profile in flattering light. He had left before the room could attach itself to him. He had felt the disturbance long before he saw it, not in the way a man noticed danger, but in the way his other sense noticed intrusion. There was a wrongness at the edge of his territory, a thin ripple in the city's pattern that suggested someone had stepped where they did not belong. His security reported nothing unusual. They would not have, not with the kind of presence he detected. He moved through the streets in a car that looked ordinary to anyone who did not know what to notice. He watched the city as it slid past, its wet surfaces blurring into a single restless skin. He did not go toward the disturbance out of curiosity. He went because the border had shifted, and borders required response. The warehouse district was a stain the city never scrubbed. It was where shipments disappeared and reappeared, where bodies were moved when someone wanted them found later, or not found at all. It was also where older rules surfaced, because modern surveillance did not penetrate certain kinds of agreements. Marcus's people had influence there, but influence was never the same as absolute ownership. He stepped out of the car and let the rain touch his skin, cold and thin. He moved without hurry, each step deliberate. The beast inside him listened. It catalogued. It tasted the air. There, in that dense quiet, he sensed her before he saw her fully. Myra stood near a loading dock, posture controlled, face turned slightly as if she had heard something most humans would miss. She was not panicked. She was not performing bravado. She carried herself like someone who had learned that fear wasted time. The men who had cornered her were not street predators. Their movement lacked the messy hunger of opportunistic violence. They were disciplined, trained for capture, not thrill. That fact mattered. Marcus recognized the faint signature of a rival influence, a kind of aggression that believed itself protected by distance and deniability. He did not address them. He did not need to. He moved into the space with the authority of a man who had already decided the outcome. The men registered him, hesitated, recalculated. In the fraction of a second where they weighed options, the beast inside Marcus pushed forward like pressure behind glass. His control tightened, not loosening. He used it like a blade. The men withdrew with a speed that suggested they had been given strict instructions not to provoke a direct confrontation. One vanished into the rain-dark gap between warehouses. Another retreated toward a vehicle that did not start fast enough to be casual, yet not slow enough to be challenged. The street swallowed them without drama. When the last presence faded, the space felt unnaturally clean, as if the city had wiped its mouth. Marcus did not chase. Chasing belonged to men who needed spectacle. He preferred consequences that arrived later, in places that could not be photographed. His attention returned to Myra. She should have been ordinary by every external marker, young enough to be overlooked by those who did not know what to look for, plainly dressed, rain-soaked, carrying nothing that suggested status. Yet her presence struck him as wrong in a different way. Not wrong like a threat, but wrong like a misfiled document, an anomaly that made the entire system look imperfect. Then the scent hit him. It was not perfume, not shampoo, not rain on fabric. It was something beneath all that, something that carried a faint mineral edge and an undertone of warmth that should have belonged to a living body, yet felt connected to something older. It did not fit any category he knew. It did not match the expected signatures of his world. It disturbed the beast inside him in a way that was not rage and not hunger. It made the beast stop. That pause was what startled him most. The beast was built for reaction. It pushed toward dominance, toward claiming territory, toward eliminating unpredictability. It rarely hesitated unless something held authority over it. Myra's scent did not command like an alpha's would. It did not challenge. It simply existed, and the beast listened as if hearing a signal it had been trained to recognize long before Marcus had learned discipline. The effect rippled through him, subtle yet undeniable. His heart rate shifted. His lungs took in air too deeply. Something inside his nervous system recalibrated, as if his body had been waiting for a missing variable. He kept his face still. He kept his posture loose. He did not allow surprise to change his silhouette in the rain. Myra turned her head just enough to let him see her profile. She did not offer gratitude. She did not ask who he was. She did not do any of the things that made people predictable. Her eyes held calculation rather than awe. She looked at him the way she might look at a locked door, assessing hinges, listening for weakness. Marcus found that unsettling and, in a way he did not like to admit even to himself, fascinating. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to know why the beast reacted to her as if she were a forgotten law. He wanted to know who had sent trained men after someone who looked like she should not matter. But he did not ask, because questions created threads, and threads created obligations. He had learned long ago that the fastest way to lose control was to give someone proof that they were important. He let the moment end on silence. Myra walked away. Not quickly, not in panic, but with a calm that suggested she did not believe she had been saved, only delayed. The rain wrapped around her like a veil. She disappeared into the city's wet glare. Marcus watched her go until she blended into the moving geometry of streets and headlights. He could have followed. He could have ordered someone else to. He did neither immediately. He stood there, letting the scent fade, measuring the aftershock inside himself. Control returned, but it returned with a new awareness. The city's pattern had shifted. He could feel it in the air, in the way the night seemed slightly more attentive, as if the streets were waiting to see what he would do next. Back in the car, he did not speak to anyone. He reviewed the district through the tinted glass, the warehouses standing like old bones. His security asked if he was ready to leave. He nodded. The car moved, and the city resumed its flow around him. But Marcus did not resume his internal equilibrium. He spent the rest of the night in his office, a space designed to keep emotion out. Screens displayed financial streams, property maps, lists of names. His people brought him reports about minor disruptions across the city. He read them with detached efficiency, but his attention kept circling back to the warehouse district and the scent that had made the beast inside him listen. He understood, with a kind of cold clarity, that Myra was not merely a woman who had wandered into a dangerous area. She was an anomaly with gravity, the kind of anomaly that made systems reveal their seams. He started pulling threads without making it obvious. A quiet request to check recent archive access logs, phrased as routine. A discreet inquiry into unclaimed incidents in the warehouse district. A search through old records for names that had been altered, families that had disappeared, files that had been moved into private storage under administrative excuses. He did not expect fast answers. He expected resistance. Resistance meant something valuable was being protected. By the time dawn began to thin the night, he had confirmed one thing. Someone had already been shaping the city around her. Not with crude force, but with quiet preparation. The kind of preparation that only existed when the goal was inevitable. He allowed himself a brief, controlled anger. Not at Myra, not at the men who had cornered her, but at the idea that something had been arranged inside his territory without his permission. He had built his empire on the promise that nothing of consequence happened in this city without passing through his hands. The warehouse district had reminded him that promises were fragile. He left his office as morning light leaked into the skyline. The city looked almost innocent in daylight, its wet surfaces reflecting pale gold. Marcus knew better. Innocence was just another facade the city used to keep people moving. He did not go to Myra. He did not send a messenger. He did not offer protection as a gift. He simply noted, with the same calm he used for everything that mattered, that the city had begun to tighten around her. Like a trap that had been built over years and was finally being tested. And he understood, with a certainty that sat heavy in his chest, that his own control would soon be challenged by something he could not negotiate with. The parts of himself that recognized Myra as a signal, and the forces in the city that would not tolerate her existing outside their design. The information surfaced the way forbidden things always did in the city, not as a revelation, but as a correction. A misplaced figure in an old ledger. A sealed file referenced twice under different dates. A name that appeared in inheritance records without ever appearing in birth registries. Marcus followed these traces with methodical patience, letting them guide him through layers of intentional absence. Myra's connection to the clans was not speculative. It was structural. Blood-linked, codified, verified by rights that predated the city's modern grid. Yet every marker that should have activated that inheritance had been deliberately muted. Someone had intervened early, surgically stripping access without killing the source. It was not exile. It was containment. The records told a careful story. A lineage marked as unstable. A child categorized as non-viable for succession, yet too valuable to erase outright. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, cruel in its restraint. Myra had not been cast out because she was weak. She had been sealed because she was unfinished. Something in her had been deemed dangerous if allowed to mature. To the clans, she was a mistake that refused to disappear. To their enemies, she was leverage wrapped in ignorance. Marcus closed the final file and leaned back, feeling the weight of a decision forming with mechanical certainty. The city did not tolerate loose variables for long. If he did nothing, someone else would, and they would not be interested in preserving her autonomy or her life. He did not consider asking for her consent. That was not how protection worked at this level. Consent was a luxury afforded to people whose existence did not destabilize systems. The move was executed quietly. Myra was intercepted at the end of another night shift, not with force, but with inevitability. Transportation arrived without sirens, without urgency. The city barely noticed her absence as she was carried upward, away from the streets that had shaped her survival instincts. Marcus's residence did not announce itself as a fortress. It was too refined for that. The building rose from the city like a vertical extension of authority, all glass and steel engineered to imply transparency while permitting none. Security was integrated into architecture rather than displayed. Every entry point was layered, every transition measured. Inside, the air changed. It lost the city's constant hum and took on a controlled stillness. Myra felt it immediately. The silence was not empty, it was curated. The interior was stripped of ornamentation. Stone, dark wood, brushed metal. No personal artifacts, no photographs, no visible history. The space did not invite comfort. It enforced focus. Light moved through the rooms in deliberate paths, guided by angles that emphasized order over warmth. This was not a place meant to shelter vulnerability. Myra was given a room that overlooked the city but did not belong to it. The glass was reinforced, tinted just enough to remind her that visibility did not equal access. The furnishings were minimal but precise, every object placed for function rather than personality. Nothing here asked her who she was. Everything assumed she would adapt. Marcus maintained distance. He did not linger. He did not explain. His presence was felt more in absence than proximity. Schedules adjusted around her without consulting her. Security protocols shifted. Names appeared and disappeared from access lists. The machinery of protection began to move, indifferent to her opinion. Control was absolute, but not theatrical. No restraints, no threats, just an environment that made escape impractical and resistance irrelevant. Myra understood the shift quickly. She had lived long enough in margins to recognize ownership when it changed hands. Her life had been absorbed into a larger structure, and the rules governing it were no longer negotiable. She moved through the space cautiously at first, mapping patterns, nodding sightlines, listening to the building breathe. Elevators required biometric clearance she did not have. Doors responded to permissions she had not been granted. Even the air circulation felt monitored, its rhythm too steady to be accidental. Outside, the city continued its indifferent choreography. Traffic flowed. Lights cycled. People lived and died without knowing she had been removed from the equation. That realization cut deeper than fear. She had believed herself invisible by choice. Now she understood she had been invisible by design. Time passed without markers. Meals arrived without ceremony. Medical evaluations were conducted without explanation, measuring variables she did not recognize. Blood was drawn. Scans were taken. Data was recorded and archived. She was being assessed, not treated. In the quiet hours, fragments of memory surfaced. Not scenes, but sensations. The feeling of pressure behind the eyes when standing near certain people. The way her heartbeat changed in rooms filled with suppressed aggression. How mirrors sometimes felt like thresholds rather than reflections. These had never seemed significant before. Now they aligned too neatly with the conclusions Marcus had drawn from his files. Her past was not a series of failures. It was a containment protocol. Marcus watched the city from his office as reports filtered in. The reaction had begun almost immediately. Old alliances adjusted tone. Communication channels once dormant flickered back to life. Meetings were requested under the guise of unrelated business. The clans felt the disturbance like a fault line shifting beneath their feet. They did not know exactly what Marcus had taken, but they knew he had taken something. That alone was enough to unsettle decades of negotiated balance. He considered the implications without sentiment. Housing Myra placed her under his jurisdiction, whether the clans acknowledged it or not. Any move against her would now be an act of escalation. Any attempt to reclaim her would expose motives that had remained hidden for years. It was a calculated risk, one he accepted without hesitation. The house became a boundary zone. Inside it, Myra was shielded from immediate harm. Outside it, forces recalibrated, testing how far they could push without triggering open conflict. Marcus allowed the tension to stretch. Pressure revealed intent. Intent created leverage. He did not pretend this arrangement was benevolent. It was strategic. Myra was safer here than anywhere else in the city, but safety came with a cost. Her autonomy had been suspended, pending outcomes decided by people who spoke the language of power fluently. Myra felt the shift in herself as days accumulated. Not empowerment, awareness. The quiet, forced introspection she had avoided for years. She began to sense the edges of something dormant, something restrained not by absence, but by interference. The building amplified it, its sterile order pressing against whatever chaos had been denied expression. She realized then that the city had never truly let her go. It had simply kept her dormant, moving her through systems designed to observe rather than engage. Now, under Marcus's control, that dormancy was being reevaluated. Outside, whispers multiplied. Old contracts were revisited, language sharpened. The name Marcus carried more weight than usual in places where names were typically buried under titles. He had crossed an unspoken line by reclaiming what others believed they had successfully neutralized. He remained unmoved by the pressure. He had anticipated resistance. What interested him was not that the clans reacted, but how quickly. Their urgency suggested fear rather than indignation, which confirmed his suspicion. Myra was not valuable because of what she was now, but because of what she might become if allowed access to what had been sealed inside her. Someone had invested considerable effort into ensuring that never happened. That investment implied stakes far beyond her individual existence. Marcus stood by the window as night settled over the city once more, watching lights ignite in predictable patterns. He felt the beast inside him stir, not with hunger, but with recognition. Whatever had been done to Myra had disrupted balances older than his own discipline. He did not regret the decision. Regret belonged to those who hesitated. The deal had been made without her consent, and he was fully aware that one day she would understand that fact with clarity sharp enough to cut him. He accepted that future consequence as part of the transaction. Because some deals were not meant to be fair, they were meant to be final. And now that the clans were moving, old agreements cracking under the strain of renewed interest, Marcus knew the city had entered a phase where neutrality would no longer be possible. The game had shifted inward, and Myra, whether she wished it or not, stood at its center. The attempt to remove Marcus did not announce itself with spectacle. There was no rupture in the skyline, no echo of gunfire tearing through glass and steel. It arrived the way old wars preferred to arrive, dissolved, patient, intimate. Poison introduced into water that had passed every modern inspection, carried through pipes that had been laid decades ago under different names and forgotten agreements. A method chosen not for efficiency, but for symbolism. a reminder that some conflicts never truly evolved. Marcus noticed the anomaly before his body reacted. The taste was wrong. Subtle mineral layered beneath the neutral purity engineered into his water system. He registered it as data first, an inconsistency, and swallowed anyway. Habit, discipline, trust in systems he had designed himself. The response came seconds later, not as pain, but as distortion. His heartbeat altered rhythm, slowed, then surged. Heat spread through his veins with unnatural precision, as if something ancient had been given permission to wake. The poison did what it was meant to do to a human body. His body simply refused to behave like one. Myra was not meant to witness it. She had been moving through the upper level of the residence, still learning the architecture of containment, still adjusting to the quiet that pressed in from all sides. She noticed the change in the air first. A pressure drop, barely perceptible, like the moment before a storm collapses inward. The house, usually so controlled, seemed to hold its breath. She followed the sensation rather than a sound. Instinct guided her to the private living space where Marcus had been alone. She paused at the threshold, sensing something she could not name, something that pulled at the spaces inside her that had long been dormant. Marcus was on his knees when she saw him, not in collapse, not in weakness, but in transition. His hands were braced against the stone floor, fingers digging in as if anchoring himself to the physical world. His breathing was measured, forced into discipline even as his body rebelled. The lines of his control were visible now, strained but unbroken. She should have stepped back. She should have left him to whatever ritual of survival he was performing. Instead, she stayed, frozen not by fear, but by recognition. The change in him was not grotesque. There was no eruption of bone or tearing of skin, no cinematic violence. The transformation was internal, structural. His posture shifted subtly, spine aligning with predatory efficiency. His muscles tightened in patterns too precise to be accidental. His eyes, when they lifted, reflected light differently, as if depth had been added where none had existed before. What frightened Myra was not the presence of something monstrous. It was the absence of chaos. The beast inside Marcus did not burst free. It did not snarl or rage or demand release. It moved with the same restraint that governed every other aspect of him, integrated, disciplined, bound not by chains, but by will. This was not a man struggling to contain a monster. This was a monster that had learned to live as a man. The poison burned itself out quickly, metabolized by a system that refused its premise. Marcus remained still until the last tremor faded, until his pulse returned to its carefully regulated cadence. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge Myra's presence. He did not speak. He did not explain. He did not need to. The truth had already filled the room. Myra understood in that moment why the house felt the way it did, why its silence was not emptiness, but suppression, why control permeated every surface. The residence was not merely a place of power. It was a containment field built around a man who could not afford to lose himself. The realization shifted something in her perception. Marcus was no longer just the architect of the city's invisible order. He was a fracture that had been stabilized through sheer discipline, a being balanced on the edge of something far older than contracts and foundations. What unsettled her most was not fear for herself, but the sudden clarity of her own effect on him. As the room settled, as his breathing evened out, she felt it again. The subtle change in pressure, the internal quiet that followed the storm. His body responded to her presence the way it had in the warehouse district, but now the scale was unmistakable. The beast inside him receded not because it was forced back, but because something in the environment allowed it to rest. That something was her. Marcus rose slowly, every movement deliberate. His composure returned piece by piece, layered back into place like armor. When he stood upright, he was once again the man the city recognized. Controlled, implacable, dangerous in his restraint. But something had shifted irreversibly. He acknowledged the obvious without words. Her presence had altered the outcome. Whether by scent, proximity, or some deeper mechanism neither of them fully understood, she had functioned as a stabilizing force, an anchor, not chosen, not requested, simply effective. For someone like Marcus, this realization carried weight beyond personal vulnerability. It was strategic, existential, the kind of truth that redrew maps. If her presence prevented him from crossing the line he had spent years guarding against, then her existence threatened every balance the clans depended on. She was no longer just a sealed anomaly. She was a variable capable of influencing apex forces. That made her intolerable. Outside the residence, the city continued its routines, unaware of how close it had come to rupture. The poison attempt was already being erased, filtered through layers of countermeasures that Marcus had set in motion long before the first sip. Suppliers would vanish. Channels would close. Someone would pay a price that could not be traced back to him. But the message had been delivered. The clans had chosen an old weapon because old rules were coming back into play. They had confirmed that they viewed Marcus not as an untouchable constant, but as a target once more. And they had done so knowing that Myra was under his protection. The implications were clear. Myra felt the city respond before she could articulate why. The building's sensors adjusted. Security protocols shifted frequency. Outside, the traffic patterns below changed subtly, as if the city itself were recalibrating routes around her. She had lived long enough as background noise to recognize attention when it arrived. This attention was different, heavier, focused. She returned to her room later that night with a new awareness settling into her bones. The emptiness she had carried for years, the strange absence where something should have been, began to feel less like a void and more like a space prepared for occupation. Not power, not violence, something quieter, a function rather than a force. She stood by the reinforced glass and watched the city recognize her in its own way. Lights flickered differently. Sounds traveled further. The air felt more responsive, as if acknowledging a presence it had previously ignored. Marcus remained elsewhere in the house, restoring his routines, reinforcing the internal order that kept the beast contained. Yet even as control reasserted itself, he knew the line had shifted. The threshold he had feared crossing was no longer a solitary boundary. It was now shared. For the clans, this night clarified their options with brutal simplicity. Myra could not be left free. She could not be allowed to develop unchecked. She represented a stabilizing element in a system that thrived on controlled volatility. She would either be bound, repurposed, reduced to something manageable, or she would be eliminated. Myra sensed this without being told. The city had begun to look at her differently, not with indifference, but with calculation. She had crossed from unnoticed to necessary, from irrelevant to dangerous. The night of recognition ended without ceremony. No declarations, no promises, just the quiet understanding that nothing between her and Marcus was accidental anymore. Control had revealed its limits. And something older, something patient, had opened its eyes. The abduction did not fracture the city with noise or spectacle. It unfolded the way competent violence always did, efficiently, invisibly, leaving behind only a rearranged absence. Myra disappeared between one monitored corridor and the next, in a span of time too small to register as failure until it was already complete. No alarms triggered. No cameras caught anything that could not later be explained away as routine interference. Whoever took her understood Marcus's systems well enough to move through them without panic. That alone marked the act as a declaration. This was not a negotiation. No demands followed. No proof of life arrived. There was no attempt to monetize her value in a way that suggested profit. The clans had not taken Myra to gain leverage in the conventional sense. They had taken her to provoke an outcome. They wanted to see Marcus lose control. The city reacted before he did. Traffic patterns stuttered. Information channels spiked with contradictory signals. Old contacts resurfaced under the guise of concern, their voices carrying tension they could not fully conceal. Marcus observed it all with cold clarity, absorbing the data without letting it dictate his response. He did not issue threats. He did not call councils. He did not invoke treaties. He began to hunt. This was not the hunt of an alpha asserting dominance over territory. It was the hunt of a creature that understood restraint as a tactical choice rather than a moral one. Marcus stripped away the layers of civility he usually employed and worked directly through the city's oldest structures. He followed pressure changes instead of protocols, fear instead of allegiance. He moved through locations the clans preferred to forget they still used: abandoned infrastructure nodes, private medical facilities funded through shell organizations, safe houses disguised as philanthropic dormitories. Each stop revealed fragments of the same intention. Myra was being kept alive, isolated, measured. She was not a hostage. She was a subject. Myra became aware of her captivity in stages. The first sensation was absence, not darkness, but neutralization. Smell evaporated. Sound flattened into something distant and untextured. Her body registered temperature without registering source. The space around her resisted orientation, its dimensions deliberately ambiguous. They had built the place to deny instinct. Her restraints were subtle. No chains, no visible barriers. Instead, the air itself felt dense, chemically altered to interfere with neurological responses. Whatever facility held her had been designed by people who understood non-human biology well enough to suppress it without triggering panic responses. The clans had learned from past mistakes. In that controlled void, Myra's thoughts slowed. Not dulled, but narrowed. External stimuli ceased to matter, forcing her inward. It was there, in that enforced silence, that understanding began to coalesce. She had always believed something was missing from her, a hollow where power should have been. The clans had encouraged that belief, letting her internalize weakness as identity. Now, deprived of distractions, she felt the truth press back against her awareness. It was not absence, it was containment. Her gift did not announce itself as strength. It manifested as equilibrium. When panic threatened to rise, it softened. When fear attempted to sharpen into aggression, it diffused. Her presence altered internal states, drawing unstable systems back toward coherence. It was subtle enough to be dismissed in ordinary life. In proximity to extremes, it became undeniable. She understood then why the clans had sealed her rather than destroyed her. She was not a weapon they could wield easily. She was a regulator, a stabilizing factor in a hierarchy that depended on controlled volatility. In the presence of beings like Marcus, whose power required constant discipline to avoid collapse, her effect was disruptive in the most dangerous way. She made monsters quieter. That was unacceptable. They kept her sedated just enough to prevent focused application of that influence. Sensors tracked her vitals. Chemical suppressants adjusted in response to fluctuations they had clearly anticipated. The clans did not underestimate her anymore. They treated her as a problem that needed to be managed until a permanent solution could be agreed upon. Outside, Marcus moved faster than the city expected. He did not seek consensus. He bypassed intermediaries and severed channels without warning. Financial arteries collapsed overnight. Individuals who believed themselves insulated by distance found their protections failing simultaneously. He applied pressure with surgical precision, not to cause chaos, but to force errors. Every error left a trail. He followed behavioral shifts rather than physical evidence. A sudden relocation of personnel, a change in supply schedules, increased activity around sites previously marked as dormant. He let the beast inside him guide perception without allowing it to dictate action. The distinction was critical. Losing control would validate the clan's thesis. Retaining it would destabilize them. The hunt became personal, not because of emotion, but because the variables now included Myra's life span under suppression. He calculated timelines. The longer she remained isolated, the more likely permanent damage would occur, either to her or to the fragile balances she unconsciously maintained. He abandoned diplomacy entirely. Old rules dissolved under the urgency of retrieval. When he found the facility, it was buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. Medical on the surface, research below, private funding masked as philanthropic grants. The kind of place that existed precisely because no one wanted to admit it did. Marcus did not wait for confirmation, beyond his own certainty. The extraction was not elegant. He disabled the outer systems first, collapsing redundancies faster than they could adapt. Power flickered, not out, but unevenly, creating blind spots. Security personnel were neutralized with minimal force, incapacitated rather than killed. This was not mercy. It was efficiency. Dead men created investigations. Unconscious ones created silence. He moved through the lower levels with controlled speed, every sense attuned. The beast strained against its constraints, responding to proximity, to the echo of Myra's presence beneath layers of chemical suppression. He allowed it just enough latitude to sharpen perception, never enough to fracture intent. When he reached her, the environment reacted before he did. Systems spiked. Monitors registered anomalies they could not interpret. Myra lay restrained not by bindings, but by atmosphere, her body unnaturally still, breath shallow but steady. The moment Marcus crossed the threshold, something shifted. The suppression field faltered, not because it failed mechanically, but because it encountered a variable it had not been designed to counter. The stabilizing effect Myra exerted responded to proximity with instinctive clarity. Her presence reached for coherence. His internal pressure eased in response. The effect was mutual. He freed her without ceremony, dismantling the systems maintaining her isolation. As the chemical fog thinned, Myra's awareness sharpened rapidly. She did not wake into confusion. She woke into recognition. The facility descended into controlled chaos. Systems failed in sequence. Emergency protocols conflicted. Personnel retreated rather than regrouped, sensing that containment had been breached beyond repair. They left quickly. Those who remained did so only long enough to ensure their own survival. Marcus and Myra exited through corridors already shedding relevance, the structure collapsing into irrelevance behind them. The city absorbed the disruption without alarm. By the time emergency responses arrived, there was nothing left to investigate that could not be explained away. Freedom did not feel like relief to Myra. It felt like exposure. The suppression had been painful, but clarifying. Now, released back into the city's uncontrolled noise, she felt the full weight of her nature pressing outward. She understood that the emptiness she had carried was gone. In its place was responsibility she had never asked for. Marcus observed the change with careful restraint. She moved differently now, not stronger, more centered, as if her internal gravity had increased. He recognized the danger immediately. Others would too. The clans had failed to break him. They had failed to erase her. But failure did not end conflict. It refined it. The hunt had not concluded. It had escalated. Myra understood this without needing explanation. There was no returning to anonymity, no resuming the margins she had once survived in. The city would not allow it, and neither would the forces that had invested so much in keeping her dormant. She had crossed from being a variable to being a factor. Marcus returned her to his residence under heightened security, but the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. This was no longer containment under the guise of protection. It was alignment under pressure. The hunt had run both ways, stripping illusions from predator and prey alike. What remained was necessity. And necessity did not negotiate. The city received them in silence, the kind that followed storms powerful enough to redraw invisible borders. Streets resumed their routines, lights flickered back into familiar patterns, and the skyline reclaimed its composed indifference. To an untrained eye, nothing had changed. To those who understood how power breathed beneath concrete and glass, the quiet carried weight. The clans had withdrawn their visible pressure. No immediate retaliation followed the extraction. No public moves, no overt challenges. That restraint was not defeat. It was recalculation. They had learned something essential. Myra could not be removed easily, and Marcus could not be provoked into losing himself without consequence. The next phase would not be loud. It would be deliberate. Myra felt the shift more acutely than anyone else. The city no longer slid past her as background noise. It reacted. Crowds parted with subtle timing. Conflicts dulled in her proximity. In moments of tension, she sensed invisible lines tightening, then easing as if the environment itself adjusted to her presence. It was not control. It was influence, emerging gradually, demanding awareness rather than force. Her gift did not rush to the surface. It unfolded slowly, like something learning it was allowed to exist. She noticed it in small, unsettling ways. A surge of anger in a nearby room softened without explanation. An anxious guard's breathing steadied when she passed. Even Marcus, who rarely allowed deviation from his internal equilibrium, seemed less strained when she occupied the same space. The beast inside him did not disappear. It rested. This frightened her more than captivity ever had. Power that announced itself could be resisted. Power that worked quietly rewrote outcomes before anyone realized a decision had been made. She understood now why the clans had chosen suppression over execution. Her existence threatened structures built on managed instability. She did not break systems. She neutralized extremes. And in a world where dominance depended on controlled chaos, neutrality was a weapon. Marcus observed these changes without illusion. He no longer told himself she was merely under his protection. The house, the security, the routines were no longer sufficient explanations for what bound them. Their connection operated on a level deeper than strategy, yet more dangerous than sentiment. He had built his life on contracts that defined obligation clearly. This was not one of them. Her presence affected his control in ways that unsettled him precisely because they felt right. The discipline he had forged to keep the beast contained no longer required constant reinforcement. That relief was intoxicating and therefore unacceptable. He did not trust ease. Ease created dependency. Dependency created leverage. He adjusted his routines accordingly, increasing distance where possible, reinforcing professional boundaries, even as circumstances made them increasingly artificial. But no amount of protocol could erase the truth revealed in the night of poison and the aftermath of the hunt. Myra was not a passive asset. She was an active variable, and one that responded to him as much as he responded to her. This mutual vulnerability reshaped their dynamic into something neither of them had consented to. Not romance, not partnership. A balance of power where each represented the other's limit. The city sensed this alignment. Whispers returned, quieter now, more careful. New players entered old conversations. Analysts recalculated risk profiles. Some factions began to consider Myra not as a target, but as a potential solution. Others saw her as an existential threat that needed addressing before her influence solidified. Marcus refused all overtures. He understood the cost of letting others define her role. The clans had already attempted that once, sealing her potential behind layers of interference. Allowing them, a second attempt would not end in compromise. It would end in erasure, one way or another. Myra spent long hours at the reinforced windows, watching the city recognize her in fragments. She thought about the life she had lived before containment, before abduction, before knowledge. It felt distant now, not because it had been false, but because it had been incomplete. She had survived by remaining unnoticed. That option no longer existed. The realization did not bring despair. It brought clarity. She began to explore her gift cautiously, testing its edges not through confrontation, but through observation. She noted how proximity altered outcomes, how emotional volatility dampened when she centered herself. She learned that the effect intensified when she resisted the urge to withdraw. Her instinct had always been to minimize. Now minimization weakened her control. This forced her into an uncomfortable truth. Her gift required presence. Presence meant visibility. Visibility meant becoming a factor in conflicts she had once avoided. There was no safe distance from influence. Marcus watched this evolution with measured concern. He had anticipated resistance, fear, denial. Instead, Myra adapted with quiet resolve. She did not seek permission. She did not ask for reassurance. She moved as if accepting a responsibility that had always belonged to her, whether she wanted it or not. That acceptance made her more dangerous than any rebellion could have. The clans, sensing this shift, began to reposition. Some withdrew resources from contested territories. Others consolidated power in anticipation of instability. No one moved openly against Marcus, but the balance grew taut. Everyone waited to see how Myra would be used. She was not used. That was her choice. The turning point came not with confrontation, but with decision. Myra understood that remaining under Marcus's protection without defining her own position would eventually make her a liability to him and a prize to others. She could not stay hidden within his structure indefinitely. Doing so would simply delay the inevitable and concentrate its violence. She chose to stay. Not as a captive, not as a symbol, as an actor. She began working within the city's margins again, but differently now. She did not erase herself from systems. She entered them selectively, stabilizing negotiations that threatened to turn predatory, diffusing conflicts before they metastasized. Her influence spread quietly, attributed to luck, timing, improved judgment. The city adjusted without realizing why. Marcus allowed this with reluctance. Every instinct told him to restrict exposure, to control variables, to keep her within parameters he understood. Yet he recognized the paradox. Restricting her would eventually weaken the very equilibrium she created. Trust, he realized, was another form of risk management. Their relationship settled into something neither fully acknowledged. A standing agreement without terms, mutual awareness of consequence. He provided infrastructure. She provided balance. Neither pretended this was sustainable forever. The city moved toward a new phase of conflict, quieter but more complex. Power consolidated in unfamiliar configurations. Old alliances dissolved. New fault lines appeared, not between clans, but between philosophies of control. Myra stood at the center of these shifts, not commanding them, but influencing outcomes by existing within reach. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.